What is going on, guys? Vert Devoten here. You don't need to see my face for this. We're going to be listening to another Chris Hayes podcast. Um, and this is about immigration and hopefully specifically about how Trump basically killed a bipartisan bill that now Trump and JD Couch fucking Vance are somehow running on it right now, that somehow they can fix quite literally the problem they created because Trump didn't want to give Joe Biden a quote unquote win. So if you're unfamiliar with this, I wouldn't be surprised. But basically, there was this long negotiation, I don't know, like 5 months maybe or something like that. And it was a bipartisan border deal. And there were some other things attached to it. I don't know exactly everything that was in the bill. I vaguely remember that this also had to do with getting the funding for Ukraine through Congress. And anyway, so they came up with this bipartisan deal, and Joe Biden read it, and or his team or whoever reads him the bedtime news. And he was like, yeah, I'll sign this. Go ahead. Just, pass it through Congress and I'll sign it. And then Trump, like a couple days later, got so mad about this, he told his MAGAt followers to kill it. And they did. And now, again, it's the amount of delusion that these cultists have to continue to support Trump is, I can't honestly conceptualize the amount of mental gymnastics you have to do to sit there and say that it's Joe Biden and Democrats' fault for not securing the border when Trump has, at several venues and online, told Republicans to kill the deal, and those spineless fucking just, ugh. And they did it. Like, they killed it. And so hopefully they'll go, I'll leave it to them. They're going to go into more detail than I can.
Pandora makes it easy for you to find your favorite music.
Ashley makes a more color
inability to sort of talk thoughtfully about border security, I think, has provided an opening for Republicans, an opening that we don't need to give them. So that, I think, is what's happened over the course of the last 6 months, is that we've begun to take seriously the rules. And that, combined with our belief that immigrants are an important part of our country, all of a sudden makes a lot more people take us seriously on the broader issue of immigration and border security.
Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening with me, your host, Chris Hayes. One of the only things Republicans like to talk about policy-wise is the border and immigration. It's striking. Like, once you get out past that, there's this enormous drop-off in any kind of substantive contentions they're making or issues they're pointing to. It's like their safety blanket policy-wise. Like, and I will say this. Unlike a lot of the other stuff, which is complete nonsense or like really fabricated, like, it at least is recognizably politics. Like, they're basically saying, here's an issue, a problem, and we have a solution for it, which is at least recognizably politics, as opposed to like everything Trump is doing on like political economy or like tariffs is just like invented nonsense, basically. Like, it's not even legible as recognizably politics. And it's also the case that like Republicans and Donald Trump have had a huge advantage on the issue of immigration. That advantage, I think, is closed a bit. Democrats have been sort of on the defensive about it. And a huge part of the debate now, and again, this is like the one place where there is like a recognizably legible debate on policy, has to do with this border bill that was negotiated between Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans painstakingly. It took months behind the scenes negotiations, which they then came forward with. It was endorsed by President Biden. He said, pass it and I will sign it into law. And immediately Donald Trump came out to say, do not pass it. We do not want to give basically Joe Biden a victory, Democrats a victory. We want the border to remain as visible a problem as possible, because obviously that will help us politically. He said that. He said, blame it on me. Now, in the DNC, you saw people, and you've seen Kamala Harris say this in one of her first two ads, have talked a lot about the border bill. And there's a bunch of stuff in that bill, and often we kind of refer to it without digging into it. And I've been doing that on the show a fair amount, partly because immigration policy is very complicated. It's one thing I've learned in covering it for, honestly, I've been covering it for 20 years. I started writing about McCain-Kennedy. So today I wanted to sit down with the chief negotiator of that bill, Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy, who I actually want to talk to about a bunch of things, who I think is one of the most interesting, thoughtful, fertile-minded politicians in America. I really like talking to the senator on my show. I think he really thinks deeply about issues. And him being the point person on this really was striking to me. And we've talked about it a bit on air. We haven't really been able to delve into the details. And so Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, it's great to have you on the program.
Yeah, awesome to do this with you.
Let's start with how this, just talk me through the actual coming about of this bill negotiation. Who initiated? How did you end up in the negotiations?
So two things are happening at the end of 2023. First is we're trying to find a way to unstick the Ukraine aid bill, and Republicans are telling us that the only way we will unstick it is to put a border bill on top of it. And that was a message they delivered very clearly. Second thing that's happening is that the numbers at the border are getting really, really high. So as you get into the fall and winter of last year, we are starting to see 6, 7, 8,000 people show up every single day. The cities are getting overwhelmed. The housing shelters are at capacity. I mean, this is becoming a real logistical problem for the country. So what happened was, for those two reasons, it became pretty clear that we needed to at least entertain the idea of making some changes in law that brought some order to the southwest border, both because it could get the Ukraine bill done and also because we needed to change the laws. And the group that started working on it took a little while to form, but it became a really small group. It was James Lankford, who just kind of has the most knowledge about the border. He's not just doing the talking points. He's actually taken a lot of time to study it, but he's a really conservative Republican who's, trusted on policy, and he's pretty hardline. Kirsten Sinema is always in these rooms, right? She's just a good bridge between Republicans and Democrats, and she's really good at organizing these big, complicated negotiations. And then why am I there, right? Because I've never really worked on the issue of border policy before. I'm not an expert on immigration, but it seemed like the only way you were going to deliver this compromise was to have a progressive Democrat in that room. I just happen to believe that as a political matter, Democrats needed to recenter the way in which we talked about immigration. But I also had worked with Kirsten on the gun bill. We knew we could get these big deals done. And so the three of us started out in the fall of last year on a journey that, as you mentioned, took way too long, 4, 5, 6 months to produce that bill. It became a very, very big bill, much bigger than I think we anticipated at the beginning. And I'm actually pretty proud of it. And I'm glad that Kamala Harris is still talking about it.
One of the ironies I'll just note is, having followed this, was the Ukraine aid. Originally, the idea was, well, we all support Ukraine aid. There's bipartisan support for Ukraine aid. So there doesn't have to be an incentive for Republicans to vote for it. The incentive is that they substantively believe that we should support Ukraine in its battle against Russia. And then they all made this kind of blanket across the caucus demand, including Mitt Romney, then Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, saying, you have to give us something on the border. We won't. And then the irony is, in the end, after all the negotiations, after being like, okay, and then coming up with this bill that was endorsed by the Border Patrol Union, which, if you know their politics, tends to be pretty hard line, Donald Trump killed it. And then the Ukraine aid just passed without anything, which was the full 360 of that journey.
Yeah, and what were you left with? You were left with a fundamental reordering of the politics on immigration that hurts Republicans. As you mentioned, the gap between voters' opinions of the two parties on the issue of immigration has been cut in half. And so, yeah, it's a real interesting turn of events. The Ukraine aid happens, and Republicans' political positioning on the issue of immigration is dramatically weakened. I'm not telling you that I saw any or all of that going into it, but that's the byproduct.
No, I mean, you thought this bill was going to get passed, right? I mean, were you surprised when Trump came out to be like, kill it, and then they all literally, it took 48 hours, and then they all just said, okay, was that surprising? It was surprising to me. Was it surprising to you?
Well, I mean, let me sort of chart this for you. So for most of the negotiations, I did not think we were going to get a bill. I did not think we were going to pass it. I mean, there were a lot of moments when and of course I've come to really appreciate and respect James Lankford, but James Lankford sort of had a history at that point of always being interested in talking to Democrats, but never really being able to deliver a big, tough compromise. So there were many moments where I thought, well, this is all intentional. Republicans picked the issue of immigration as the hill to die on because they knew we couldn't get an agreement, and then they could blame it on
Right.
They could blame the failure of the immigration talks as the reason why they cowed to Donald Trump on the issue of Ukraine. But Lankford kind of outsmarted them. He's so earnest and he was so determined to get a result that he just stuck with it and stuck with it. And I was naive enough to stick with it and stick with it to the point where by the time we had gotten the bill done, and had done the hard work of, we thought, building about 20 Republican senators who are going to support it. Yes, I did believe that Saturday, Sunday, when we unveiled the bill, that we were going to actually pass it because McConnell was in the room for all of it. His people negotiated the bill. And as we were ready to release it on Sunday night, we really thought we had, probably 40 Democrats and about 20 to 25 Republicans. We thought we had enough to pass it.
Let's talk about the substance here. And I want to sort of there's two issues I think to sort of think about. And one I think is useful for liberals to hear because I think that there's so much propaganda and demagoguery about the border that it can become very easy to tune it out because it's so gross, honestly. Like the way that it's covered on Fox is like, even the drone shot, it's like, these aren't human beings. These are basically insects and animals. Like the way that it's shot is to portray to people a sense of like zombies or foreign invasion, right? But on the merits, like I was pretty blown away to look at the numbers that were happening at the southern border when it was at its highest in end of 2023 were basically rivaling Ellis Island at peak. Now, I think we all think Ellis Island is great. And many of our, like, including me, our families literally came through there. So like, I'm not like, oh, they should have shut down Ellis Island. But the thing about Ellis Island is it did at least exist for that purpose with a process to do it.
Right.
Whereas that's not the case at the southern border. So you have this kind of crazy situation where you have Ellis Island numbers along a border that isn't like designed in any way to do the thing that Ellis Island was actually engineered to do, which to me is sort of a useful way of thinking about the problem that isn't like, oh, these terrible disease-ridden foreigners are coming here.
Yeah, and we also have a much more mature system of immigration laws in which we have made, as a nation, some very concrete decisions about how many people are going to be allowed to come into the country. We have achieved some level of political consensus around that question. And that, to me, is an important consensus. It is what allows us to hold together this experiment, an agreement around how you become part of this club. And when that agreement becomes shattered, and that's really what was happening at the end of last year, you were having 10 times the number of people showing up on any given day than we were equipped to handle. It does cause a lot of people in this country, not just hardened MAGA conservatives, but a lot of middle of the road folks to kind of, question whether there's, any rules at all. And that, I think, compromises people's sort of belief in the sanctity of the collective when there's no clear understanding of how you become a member of it. So this was a legitimate issue at late 2023, and it was happening for a host of understandable reasons, but it deserved for Congress to address it.
So I think maybe it's useful to talk in three lanes about the sort of policy here. One is the nature of asylum, because these are people, in 1994, for instance, right? If you're coming across the border, you're not presenting to a border patrol person. You're trying to avoid border patrol. You're trying to sneak into the country and then find a place you can get a job, right? And off the books. So there's something different happening here. So there's the asylum issue. There's the sort of legal nature of asylum. Then there's the sort of processing logistics of stuff. And then there's the legal pathways. Like if you want to come to the country legally, which people do, how do you do it? So let's just start on asylum. Like, what is your understanding, again, on the merits as opposed to the politics of what is and isn't working about the asylum law we have?
So if you are in an emergency circumstance, if you are fleeing violence or terror or torture, historically, there are two ways to get to the United States. One is the refugee system, right? And that is a system where you're processed outside of the United States. You often have to wait in a line. There's a certain number of refugees, around 100,000 that we let in every year. But then we have always allowed this other way, asylum, for people who are in true emergency circumstances, people who cannot go through the refugee system, people whose life are legitimately in jeopardy. So they have to just show up at the border, and we will process you through this sort of emergency system, the asylum system, and give you a chance to stay. The problem is that there's way more people that need to come to this country for legitimate reasons than we can handle through the refugee system. And the traffickers figured out that if they just rushed the border with way more people than we could handle, then the people coming to apply for asylum would be let into the country and essentially stay here for 5 to 10 years before anybody looked at the validity of their claim. And they'd get that benefit of 5 to 10 years.
So I'm going to stop it here real quick. And just to point out that there is this sort of misconception, and I think it's purposeful with a lot of conservatives and flat out MAGAts, that when talking about asylum, people are like, oh, I've heard this so many fucking times, and it's flat out wrong. When people say like, oh, if you're claiming asylum, you have to go through a port of entry. No, you don't. You do not have to go through a port of entry. What you do have to do in order to claim asylum, you have to be on U.S. soil. Right? You have to. And then people are like, oh, why they can't go to the consulate in their country? I'm like, because it's like a 1/4 of a block in size, and they have armed guards and fucking fences and much stricter rules to get in, because these are public officials that are basically living in there from all different countries. People are like, oh, why can't they follow the law? Asylum seekers coming to America, right? Not telling anyone, not going through border patrol, that is legal immigration. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to post that asylum law from the .gov site. And oh my God, if anyone ever tries to pull that shit on you, just tell them to go fuck themselves.
Country, even if they didn't have a valid claim of asylum. And it turns out less than half of the people who show up and claim asylum actually qualify for it. And so that legitimately looked to Americans to be really unfair, that folks, were waiting in line, and then there's a group who weren't coming to the border, getting into the country and getting 5 to 10 years here without having to prove the legitimacy of their claim. So that's a really important problem that needs to be fixed. And you either fix that by pushing more folks onto the refugee system, broadening up that pathway, or making changes to the asylum system so that you don't give people that 5 to 10 years, that you adjudicate those claims much more quickly.
And that 5 to 10 years, because I know people that have court dates. And again, I just want to say here, like, I'm a real bleeding heart on this issue, like fully, like just where I come from. And there are people that I love who are trying to come legally to this country who I think would be a credit to the country. And I'm rooting for them in some cases, like trying to help them and, through obviously legal means and such things like that. That 5 to 10 years is a product of, again, I think going back to this Ellis Island idea, it's a product of the fact that like the capacity of the system to process people, adjudicate their claims, and decide whether those claims are legitimate under American law, right, which is partly informed by international law, that capacity is just way smaller than the number of people. And so there's a line, and the line takes a really long time. What is that capacity choke point? Like, I think that's part of the bill, right? I mean, part of the things that you were guys trying to address, and the parts that seem to me like the most favorable to progressives, at least, or things that Democrats were sort of holding up as an important step, was increasing that capacity so that you're not just throwing people's claims out, you're actually processing them, but you're processing them in a timely fashion.
Yeah, I think I'd identify 2 choke points here. One is right at the beginning. There's a screening that happens when you show up at the border. And that screening, which is in the parlance of immigration law called a credible fear screening. Do you have a credible fear that if you went back home, your life would be in jeopardy? That screening was a pretty low bar. And so lots of people were passing that screening who didn't end up actually qualifying. And so that sort of loaded up the back end of the system with lots of people who actually didn't have legitimate claims. The second problem is that the back end of the system itself was just really Byzantine and cumbersome. We were dealing with these claims and still are dealing with these claims in traditional courts of law. They're immigration courts, but they, sort of have all the trappings of a normal civil procedure. And then if you lose that claim, you actually have the right to go into the federal district court. That system sort of worked okay when it was hundreds of people showing up on a weekly basis. But that level of sort of bureaucracy and formality just didn't work when it was 9,000 people coming every day. So those were the two issues that we tried to attack. We tried to raise the bar on the screen.
On the credible fear interview, the first pass.
Right, first thing. So turn more people around immediately based on, just building in some higher bars for proving that your life was going to be in jeopardy. And then second, just making that second process move a lot faster, not taking it out of the court system and putting it with a lawyer, but a hearing officer, somebody who could dispense that with that claim in a handful of days rather than in weeks and months. And listen, that does panic civil liberties advocates, right? Because that is less due process.
Less process. Yep.
Yeah, it's less process, but it does mean that all of that happens faster. And here's what you're trying to impact. You're trying to impact the decision making of individuals who are going to pay these cartels to bring them to the border. If they really have to think deeply about the merits of their claim because they know that they're going to get judged immediately, then they're going to think twice about paying the cartel $5,000 or $10,000 if they don't think that they have a good claim. But if they don't have to worry about that question because they're going to get into the United States for 10 years no matter what, then they're going to take their chance and pay for that journey. So you're trying to alter the calculus of somebody who's coming to the border who probably is just an economic migrant, not a political migrant, not somebody fleeing terror or torture. Not that the economic migrants, the people who are fleeing economic destitution, are any less compelling. It's just that the law actually doesn't say that they have a right to come here through the asylum system.
And then there's this there's this amazing piece Caitlin Dickinson did for The Atlantic about sort of, she walks with people as they cross the Darien Gap. And there's a number of things that are interesting. One of them, when you talk about the traffickers, is it's a business for them. Obviously, it's an incredibly lucrative business. And one of the things they do is they do a lot of bait and switching. Like one of the things she talks about is there's this walk through the jungle that's incredibly treacherous, where the traffickers are taking videos of people on the first day when people are filled with energy and hope and they've just gone in, and it's and then they're posting this on social media it's a walk in the jungle, and then 4 days later people are wrecked. They have illnesses. They're carrying their 2-year. I mean, it's just total desperation, and it's an advertising situation. It's genuinely a marketing situation, and a really shady bait and switch one where you're saying to people, here's what the experience is going to be like. It's not that hard. And then it's really brutal.
Well, and then listen, on top of that, you have, really awful violations, right? You have a ton of violence and rape and sexual abuse that happens to women along this journey. And then the price is never the price. So you are given a price up front. And then in many cases, either before you cross the border and sometimes even after you cross the border, you are then detained by the cartels and given a second price, right?
So there was, I'm going to talk about this because there's actually a personal anecdotal story that I have purposely not told because it technically involved using a company that I worked at, their printer and paper, basically, to help someone in this situation. So I'm going to kind of give you my story to this because I want to illustrate how easy it is to at least get some resources to help people in this situation. So I was working at this company, I ran the warehouse and the trucking side, and there was someone in the warehouse who's he came over. He was I don't know how this worked out, but he was an adult. He was working in the warehouse, and him and his brother legally emigrated here, but his mom and their baby brother were not. They were trying to get here, and it was a situation where literally in Mexico, how they were able to do it was by legal means, and they paid the money and time to go through the system. This person's parents to get him and his middle brother over here. they thought that they would have time to get money for the mother and the youngest. And what happened is that the cartel in Mexico, I don't know the details of that. I don't want to go into that. But basically threatened the life of the mother because she owned like a very small shop, but they don't give a shit. And, it was like a protection racket, like something you see on The Sopranos. And they're like, yeah, you got to pay us money. And she couldn't afford it, but she couldn't afford to shut down. And she tried to plead with them. And they basically said, well, we don't care. If you don't give us the money, we're going to kill you. And we're going to put somebody else in this, little storefront that you got here. Needless to say, the person that I was working with was, upon hearing this, was just out of his fucking mind with worry. And his family, he did everything to get his family, and he went through what they call a coyote. And something I was surprised by pleasantly is that the owner of this business, who wasn't really there, he actually fronted a good portion of this money to get this guy's family here. And that really shocked me, because the other management in place were very, very vocal Trump supporters, and very just callous individual. They would, when I go into work, I never bring up politics ever. When somebody brings up politics, I try to I keep my mouth shut, or I change the subject. If they try to ask me directly, I'm like, you know what? I don't talk about politics at work. Anyway, these people would come into the main office, where it was like an open desk environment, and start talking about the shit they heard on Fox News and how they loved it and how Trump is great and how Democrat, it was shocking to me. So when this situation came to a head, nobody else was supporting this guy. So what I did is I went online, because I knew that there were resources that you can get on oh my god, what is it called? Like the border security. I'm blanking on the name, but I'll post it in the comments. But where you can get all the resources to basically understand, okay, what is the process? Where's the paperwork that you apply? Where are resources for lawyers that work pro bono for people who obviously don't have the money, or had to pay the money to a coyote or cartels to get them across the border and are going to be broke? People with legitimate fears for this life that need to claim asylum, as this family did. And what I did is I ended up printing out in this 3-ring binder, probably close to 200 pages, but it's very well, as he's describing the laws around this and how centered they have this for people who have the ability to look it up, to read it, comprehend it, and simply print it out. I put tabs on the sections where they need to fill out. I would put dates that it needed to be submitted by. I got them in contact with a pro bono lawyer in Southern California. And while 200 pages seems like a lot of work, most of that is informational. It's telling you how to go about this system, what you need to do, identification, how to apply, what to say during your interviews, what type of interview you need, right? And it's a lot better than I think people, I didn't even know how well this system was set up until I felt an obligation to go and research this. Because the one thing that I feel like above anything else is in my ability toolkit is to research. I love research. And I will fucking dive deep on something that I am interested in. And I was really interested in making sure this guy's mother got across that border safely. So if you are in a situation, anyone in a situation like this, I'm going to post the links down below after I post this video in the description. And even if you just have a passing fancy of wondering how well organized this is, just look at it. I think it'll surprise a lot of people.
You will be allowed to cross, or you will be allowed to be let into the country if you pay double what the initial price was. It's an unbelievably inhumane way to come to the United States. For some people, it is their only recourse, but you really want to build an immigration system in which as few people as possible are forced to go that route, which is why, and we'll talk about this at some point, the bill also expanded those legal pathways by the biggest numbers in a generation.
Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about that because I think that's really, in some ways, where like the whole ball game is in certain ways. But just to stay on this, I mean, one of the things that's really difficult about this, and again, like I've covered this for a long time and I've gone around and around, these are by and large, I mean, I'm not going to generalize. It's hundreds of thousands of people. Some of them might be awful people and violent. A lot of them are incredible folks that would be a credit to the country if they were here, right? The question of how much you can change the decision-making at the margin, right? This question of deterrence. And when you're sort of face to face with what people are willing to do, I mean, it's so shocking and in some ways inspiring, right? I mean, like we've all got stories of the people that got up, that made me an American, who did crazy stuff. My great grandmother was on a ship that cracked in half and they got rescued on, everybody passes these stories down of this like incredible will. And like a lot of these folks have that. And the question of, is there a level of deterrence and hardship that can turn them back around when what they're fleeing, even if it isn't a textbook credible asylum claim, but is just something miserable enough that they're making this decision that is the most difficult decision a person can make?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think about this all the time, especially since I've spent the last year living this policy. I'd like to think that I'm the kind of parent who would choose
exactly
to go through that horror in order to save the lives of my children, or at least give them a shot to lead the kind of life that I wasn't able to live in a place like San Pedro Sula, Guatemala. And I don't know that I would be. It takes a level of courage and care and concern for your children to do that. That is, I think, foreign to a lot of us. So like start there. I think the answer to your question is that we have sort of found out the answer. So right now, the numbers of people presenting at the border are low comparably, right? 1,000 people, 2,000 people a day compared to 9,000 at the end of last year. And that is largely because the Biden administration, whether or not they have the legal ability to do this, decided to implement the changes in asylum that we wrote as part of that law, and to turn a lot of people around, regardless of the legitimacy of their claim, because they significantly raised the screening bar. So the word has sort of gotten out that it is much harder to get into the United States today. It's not impossible, but it's much harder. You have a much larger chance of being turned around. And it has caused a lot of people to decide not to pay the cartel. So the deterrent, I think we've proven that the deterrent does have some impact.
Yeah, I'll just play devil's advocate for 1 second here, because I know I've talked to immigrant advocates. I mean, one of the things they'll say is there's push and pull, and you'll see these numbers sort of go up and down, and we will try to press a button, and the button will seem to work. This has been a confounding issue for not just us, but all of Europe, like all of these places that are dealing with similar questions, starting in 2014 with the Obama administration. Like, people have pressed a bunch of buttons that seem to work for a bit and then reset, and partly because that thing that you talked about, the fire inside a parent who's like, this situation is not good for my kid and I need to get him out, is so powerful that it, in the aggregate and in the long run, the equilibrium is people want to come.
Yeah, I mean, one of my colleagues got up in the middle of the debate in our caucus on this issue and said, listen, we're not going to solve this problem until America sucks. And we don't suck yet.
That's exactly right. That's 100% the correct way to say it.
Right? Like, I mean, we are still the place where everybody wants to come, because we are a great nation. And for all the flagellating of ourselves we do, it is still a place that everybody in the world wants to be, especially if you're in a hard circumstance and want to get to a safe place. And so it is also true that we don't really know what's going on at the border right now. So yes, it is true that the numbers are not 9,000, the numbers are 1,500 today, but that's the number of people who present themselves at the border. What happens when the rules change and when the bar is raised and when there's more people being turned away is that the cartels just sneak people in, just bring people in around enforcement. So, we don't actually know whether there's a substantially lower number today than at the end of last year, because it may be that once the rules changed, a lot of the cartels just moved to move people into the country around law enforcement.
More of our conversation after this quick break.
Hey, everybody, it's Rob Lowe here. If you haven't heard, I have a podcast that's called Literally with Rob Lowe. And basically, it's conversations I've had that really make you feel like you're pulling up a. So subscribe, please, and listen.
From earth tones. Everywhere you look, things are getting more expensive. So at Consumer, you've earned this.
So this stuff was the sort of money for border enforcement, right? So there was going to be a bunch of more Border Patrol hired, billions of dollars in the budget towards CBP. Tell me about that part of it. And that's the part where I think it does feel a little bit like we've been on a one-way ratchet for as long as I've studied this issue, which is the idea is more border security, and then you can get to the place where you can have a comprehensive immigration bill, and we get more border security. If you chart how much money we spend on it, it keeps going up and up and up and up. Some people make the argument that what used to be in the sort of pre-militarized border, a lot of back and forth, that was particularly true of Mexico, that's different than I think folks coming from Central America, got cut off because we made the border so hard to cross. So people used to come for the season, they go back to their families, then they started migrating. What would the border provisions do, and how confident are you that those would be effective?
Well, first of all, it's important to know that this bill didn't have any new funding for border wall construction. And so when we talk about the billions of dollars in border security, none of that is for new border wall funding. But it is true that under current law, when you cross the border and have an asylum claim, you are actually supposed to be detained while that claim is being processed. Only when the detention capacity is exhausted are you allowed to be let into the country. That's existing law. So yes, part of what this bill did was to create more detention capability so that more people would actually have their claim processed while they were in detention. That's current law, and that is part of the deterrent effect, that you are not going to be able to be released while the claim is pending. Second, a lot of that money goes into the creation of this new asylum processing system, whereby the claim is handled in a matter of weeks rather than years. So to do that, we had to hire literally thousands of new asylum hearing officers. So we did that as well. And yes, there are some new Border Patrol officers here. It is important to know that while we do have a lot of Border Patrol, there's still more police officers in the New York City Police Department than there are Border Patrol officers. So in comparison to some of our other law enforcement outfits, this is not approaching the size of the U.S. Army. So we did have some more people hired to patrol the parts of the border that don't have structure on them.
Then the Border Patrol Union endorsed the bill, which was interesting. Did you know that was going to happen? Did you?
Well, we did, because we sought their endorsement and we consulted with them throughout the process. I mean, this is just politics.
Yeah, totally.
If you want to try to pass a bill with conservative support on the issue of immigration, you do need to have some conservative verifiers. It wasn't, and by the way, it wasn't just good enough to have the Chamber of Commerce and the Wall Street Journal. They only speak to a declining subset of Republicans these days. So the Border Patrol still has its, they are tapped into the vein of the MAGA wing of the party, and we needed at least a handful of those votes. It didn't hurt that the bill also improved salary and benefits for those that are patrolling the border, which we should have done regardless, but that helped win their support.
So let's talk about the third tranche, because I don't know how much the border bill dealt with this, but my basic take on this is America remains, when you pull it, a more pro-immigration place than a lot of other Western democracies. It's because we have a different tradition than, Sweden or, Belgium, or these different places that, were born of European nation states and have this sort of sense of what Frenchness is and, independent. And that's changing, obviously. France has become a very cosmopolitan society, and they have their own issues on this. But U.S. openness to immigration seems higher, even at the same time, all of these Western democracies are dealing with both a lot of people that want to come, building multiracial democracies, and some part of the public sentiment that's like, this is too much. And my general feeling about the U.S. is that people basically want people to come the right way, and they're pro-immigrant as long as people come the right way. And I think that often people don't understand how hard it is to come the right way. If you've ever had someone in your life, and right now I have 3 different people in my life who are across the spectrum of like social capital, socioeconomic status from different places in the world, trying very hard to come the right way. It is so hard to come the right way.
And depending on where you're from, it can be just unconscionably hard. So if you're coming to this country from Mexico, from India, from Pakistan, you are on a waiting list because we only allow a certain number of people in from certain countries. You're on a waiting list of 20 to 30 years, shorter from some other nations, but we have relatively low numbers of people on an annual basis that we allow to come here to reunite with family or to take a job. And that backlog is in part what causes people to come here through other means, because they want to be reunited with their mom or with their, with their spouse. And we make it so hard for you to do that through other mechanisms. And so, that's one of the important things this bill did. Was one of the compromises in the bill was to add a new amount of both employment visas, people coming here to work, and family visas, people coming here to reunite with family. It would have represented the biggest expansion of both categories, in 25, 40 years. Certainly not big enough to clear the backlogs, but it would have sort of cemented this idea that Republicans and Democrats both support expanding those visa pathways to come here, which is really the way we want people to come here. Ultimately, Chris, I just think we're going to have to reconsider whether we have the pathways right. I mean, I think we may need to think about having a third employment pathway to get to the United States that is maybe not a permanent pathway, but allows you to essentially do what a lot of these asylum seekers are doing. They're coming here for 5 or 10 years. They're working here for a period of time. They're filling a labor need that exists, but they're not tied to one employer, right? They actually can participate in the labor market. Right. And then they go back home after 5 or 10 years. That actually may be a new visa category we need to take a look at to allow people to come here in a different way than you do for temporary work right now, because in that system, you're tied to one employer.
Right. The employer sponsors you, which again, I mean, imagine your whole, I've known people on these employment visas, and it's like, everyone's got bosses and everyone deals with their boss. Now imagine your boss controls whether you stay in the country and your kid keeps going to their school. Like,
yeah, not a great system to expand upon. So allow people to come to the country for a period of time. They just enter the labor market, but their period is not infinite. It's not a pathway to permanent citizenship. Lots of people would take advantage of that. It would scratch an itch that we have in our economy and maybe release a political pressure valve, because we are now filling that labor need either through people in the completely sort of shadow part of our labor economy or through this temporary asylum system that is really not how the system was meant to be used.
I had a conversation, one of the people that I know relatively close with who's an asylum seeker, I'll sort of anonymize his details, but, from Central America came. The thing that precipitated the departure was a 14-year-old boy who's basically going to reach this point in their neighborhood where you join the gangs or else, basically. Yep. Didn't want that. Left, came here, still has home back, a house that his sibling is looking after. And I think ideally would maybe be here for 5 years while the kids move through the period in which they have that acute threat, basically, from gang recruitment, but also loves his homeland and loves the city he grew up in and misses his family and misses his home, which was like a much nicer setup than like trying to grind it out and maybe would go back. I do think that there's some demand for that. Not everyone, but I think I don't think it's crazy to think that.
Yeah, I think we just, we have not, made any significant reforms to our immigration system and the pathways to get to this country since the 1980s, and the world has fundamentally changed. And that was part of my hope here, was that this was going to be, a signal that Democrats and Republicans could come together to make some, but not all of those structural changes. And one of them, to my mind, would be, more temporary pathways for people who have either temporary need or, want to make some money, but don't necessarily need or want to be here permanently.
Maybe the final place to go here, and then it sort of segues usefully. I think part of the hardness of the pill to swallow for, again, bleeding heart liberals like myself is just that, like, okay, fine. Like, if we feel like we can come together on these basic principles of an immigration system that is in the national interest, is orderly and humane, right? but retain a vision of this amazing nation bound by a creed, people from all different places, self-aware about the fact that, like, I'm only here because some people made this journey, etc. There's a conversation to have. But it's also the case that, like, the most prominent elements of their coalition, particularly the nominee for president and his chief advisor on this issue, Stephen Miller, like, and J.D. Vance in his convention speech, just like flatly have this kind of blood and soil vision of nationalism where, like, we don't like these people. They're not us. Keep them out. Stephen Miller's in a podcast talking to Stephen Bannon about how there's too many South Asian CEOs. I mean, it's like just the grossest way to think about all this. And so there's some question of, like, can you really deal with people when that's their, like, when the thing that's animating them is something that's, like, not just wrong, but actually offensive and, you know, deeply repellent to my conception of what this beautiful nation is.
Nazis.
My opinion is that that position, that blood and soil position, is unpopular.
Yeah.
Is that people in this country, many very conservative people, do love and appreciate, right, the living in a melting pot. They do have a self-awareness of the fact that we are all here. Most of us are here because of those courageous decisions that our ancestors made, and they do not want to abandon that beautiful, wonderful foundational part of America. But they legitimately care about the rules, and they think the rules are being regularly and fundamentally broken in a way that makes them kind of feel bad about the whole system of immigration. And so, to me, Democrats need to honor.
I need to just stop right there at the unbelievably Jabba the Hutt thick irony of that statement of fucking Nazikins saying that, well, they really want the rules to be followed, when Donald fucking Trump, a convicted felon who still has, I don't even know how many indictments pending against him, is the fucking nominee. A guy who has literally said he will be a dictator on day one, right? That he learned the lessons of his previous administration. And I don't care what they say, because he has talked and supported Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation directly so many times. I don't buy for a second this bullshit that Nazikins, when they say, like, wow, you know, you gotta follow the rules, they don't even know what the fucking rules are. Like, that's the biggest biggest thorn in my craw, is that they don't even know what the fucking rules are when they talk about, like, oh, you gotta go asylum, you gotta do it this way. It's like, well, no, you don't. Wow, I don't care what the rules say. It's a sort of like, again, the mental gymnastics and the circular logic presented by so many people on the right. I just don't care. I don't give a shit how they feel, because, again, let's go back to 2016 and embrace their mantra. Fuck your feelings. Fuck them.
People's feelings about how the rules are being regularly broken. We need to show earnestness about enforcing the rules and modifying the rules so that they can be more easily enforced. That broadly is followed. Is that more?
You can't modify rules willy-nilly, even through executive orders that can simply be challenged in the courts or overturned. You have to go through Congress. You cannot have a functioning Congress, and this has been proven for the last 50 years with the filibuster in place. And you cannot you have to pass these laws through Congress. And that's what, again, another thing that I have to drill down on the absolute fucking absurdity of Project 2025 and Nazi cons in general, is they are trying to unify. They sit there and bash presidents, and they sit there and talk about how, you know, we need the rule of law and presidents don't make the law, Congress does. But as soon as their guy is in power, they're like, no, he's the president. He leads us. He's the one who dictates all the laws. And that's exactly what they're trying to do. And fucking Roberts on the SCOTUS actually supported that. I mean, it may be in a small way, but it was in a completely made up way for the Trump presidential immunity claim. Even if it was just partial, it's such fucking bullshit. Sorry, I had to go off.
Broadly is the sort of concept of border security, and that a party that is vocal about border security and about a rules-based system that is also a party that is loudly pro-immigrant.
This is key, yes.
And believes that this country is stronger because of our past and our future commitment to immigration. That is a 60 to 70% party, right? That's where 60 to 70% of the country is. That's a winning electoral strategy. But I think our inability to sort of talk thoughtfully about border security, I think, has provided an opening for
talk thoughtfully? Are you fucking just watch the last couple of videos where I highlight the good liars at Trump rallies. Tell me that you can have a conversation with those knuckle dragon fucking basement dwelling incels.
Republicans an opening that we don't need to give them. So that, I think, is what's happened over the course of the last 6 months, is that we've begun to take seriously the rules. And that, combined with our belief that immigrants are an important part of our country, all of a sudden makes a lot more people take us seriously on the broader issue of immigration and border security.
Yeah, it's that. I think it's part of my frustration. I was trying to do this on the show a fair amount. Was it did feel like a certain point they were so obsessed with the border, and there was kind of nothing on the other side, such that you get this. It's just this sense of like, we're sitting here in America and we've got a pizza pie and it's got 8 slices, and there's people are just coming and just grabbing slices, and that means you're not going to get any. And that is fully the narrative. I mean, people who don't watch Fox News, I cannot overstate how central it is. It is the thing. I mean, every hour, like it is constant. And this idea that like, wait a second, doesn't quite work that way. Like they're actually like, there's lots of pies. And in fact, like the only reason we eat pizza here in the US is that like some immigrants came and brought pizza over. It's like, in fact,
I'm going to stop on this again. There is let's go on the whole pizza pie thing. Or, you guys have probably seen the meme where you see Murdoch, leaning over to a construction worker, and he's saying, that guy wants to steal all your cookies. And Murdoch is the one who actually has the plate of cookies, and there's only one cookie left in between. I think it's a beautifully constructed comic that I believe is just timeless in its point. And this is going to bleed into game theory, and I don't want to get too into this because this isn't a subject that I feel very, well, not even a little versed on. Like I know a little bit about game theory, and I'm talking like the smallest minute. So if there is somebody in here that is more knowledgeable on that and is sitting here like, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, yeah, you're probably right. But here's the idea. The best, if you tell someone, right, like, hey, you have to decide, you're going to be given a cake and you get to cut it in any portion that you want to. But you don't tell them who gets what portion, right? Now, this is kind of like a thought experiment. And 9 times out of 10, what someone is going to do is that they're going to cut the cake in half, in equal portions, right? Because they don't know what they're getting, and they don't know who the other person is, and what, how they'll benefit from it, basically. So this is kind of like a thought experiment in terms of figuring out laws that are truly just, right? That's kind of what this boils down to. And I'm sorry if I didn't articulate that as eloquently as I could, or maybe I didn't get the point across, but hopefully it makes sense, where like you don't take a birthday cake or a pie and go, I'm going to cut this section out, and this is going to be really small, and it's going to be one other section, and you don't know which section you're going to get. Humans by nature hedge their bets. Animals do this, and this is what leads into game theory, and this is where I'm going to stop the conversation on this. But my point is that democracy in and of itself is a law. Like, you don't get less democracy the more people who are involved in it, right? And the amount of land that we have open for just for people to live, for housing to be built, for jobs is so much bigger
then people understand. They think America is this small country. Like, seriously, all of fucking Europe and Asia can fit into America. Like, I know the maps are not accurate and all that shit. Like, I'm just trying to highlight the point that all of this shit that you're going to hear that Hayes is talking about on Fox News and all these crap talking points, they fall apart when you get down to the logic of what they are trying to deny to other people and the quote unquote facts that they present to justify that like logical fallacy. Man, this is going to be a really long podcast because I can't keep my big trap shut.
The whole notion of us having pizza is because we have, Italian Americans, God bless them. So that idea of like, it's not just the people coming are going to take something from you, but actually it's great that people want to come here. And a lot of them are great people who are going to do great things. And like, and I thought the DNC did a good job of that, partly because Kamala Harris is, nominee of the party, is quite famously the daughter of immigrants.
That's right.
And I thought that she did a really good job of that part of the story not being left out in the convention.
Yeah, and again, like I said, this is where the broad cross section of Americans agree. They feel good, and it's part of what makes you uniquely American, right? I mean, this is part of what most people really love about their patriotic identity, is that it is founded in this story of immigration. And it is true, right, that we still live in a society of abundance, and we just choose to deny that abundance to certain people. But there are these moments, like the end of last year, where there are actually not the resources available to take care of everybody. We did actually get to the point at the end of last year where there were choices being made by city and state governments, as to sort of who got access to housing and who got access to,
there were just not room
to space.
Not lawyers. I mean, that's one thing that I've encountered in New York City is you can't find an immigration lawyer.
Right.
I mean, there's just a mismatch between supply and demand. I mean, you've got the system now with all these people they're running these pro se clinics and stuff. And I've been working with some folks and trying to help them in their path. And like, you just can't, there's not immigration lawyers. So if there's not immigration lawyers, like there's a lot of other things that are not available.
Yeah. And at a moment like that, when the arguments that the right are making that there isn't enough to go around,
that they're taking your pizza,
is matched by evidence of that, real visual evidence of it, even if it's temporary evidence.
Yes,
that's a moment where, as a political matter, Democrats have to take that seriously.
We'll be right back after we take this quick break.
So let me get this straight. If I heard that correctly, and maybe I'm wrong, is that he said that the temporary justification for immigrants not coming here is because there's not enough immigration lawyers? Did I get that? That sounds pretty asinine. Because the people who are not claiming asylum that are trying to get here through the natural process will have access to monetary funds that people claiming asylum don't. So I don't know. It's hard for me to, and maybe this is just a simple thing of like looking up how many immigration lawyers there are. Like when you get into law, like I have to imagine that immigration law is not is not in the top 10 or even maybe even top 50 of lawyers' professional pathway, because there's probably very little money in it, and people who are immigration lawyers probably have some other aspect in immigration or law that they specialize in to pay the bills. But I would be hard pressed to use that as like a justification for bigotry, basically, and justifying like these people are taking something away from me. I think we're gonna have to cut this short because this is, I think we're about to hit an hour on this. This is gonna take forever to upload. I guess I want to leave it kind of like this, is that all throughout my life, as far back as I can remember, which is the Reagan administration, he was the first president in my lifetime that I was aware of, and was affected by policies and whatnot, is that immigrants are like the Schrodinger's cat of Nazi kind of boogeymen. They're simultaneously lazy and leeches of our system, and yet they're taking, on the other side, they're also taking everyone's job. Like, it's a complete contradiction that, I mean, you can see this. Like, The Daily Show is a good one. The Good Liars, TYT. But I mean, I'm sure Jimmy Kimmel has done it, where they've put reporters at these rallies and literally asked people, and they've said it. They've walked into the contradiction of their own logic, basically, and you can see the reaction on their face when they're dumbfounded by it. And there's this moment of like panic where their brain shuts down and they try to figure out a way to not sound like a complete fucking idiot. And it is that moment that I am going to continue to look for and get some of those like collective best of shots and keep putting those together in videos that I can post. So anyway, thank you for watching. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to get in this. I think I'll have to take tomorrow off. Today was a big news day, and yeah, we'll see what happens. Good luck, America.